Sarah Martinez sat quietly in the corner booth of Miller's coffee shop, her laptop open as she worked on her graduate thesis. The small cafe buzzed with the usual morning crowd. Business people grabbing their daily caffeine fix, students like herself buried in textbooks, and retirees enjoying leisurely conversations over steaming mugs. She adjusted her long-sleeve cardigan, a habit she'd developed over the past 3 years. The fabric covered the intricate tattoo that wrapped around her left forearm, a detailed memorial piece that held more meaning than anyone in this sleepy college town could possibly understand. The design featured a military helicopter surrounded by poppies, with coordinates etched in elegant script beneath it. Most people saw tattoos and made assumptions. Sarah had learned to keep hers hidden to avoid the judgmental stares and whispered comments. The bell above the cafe door chimed, and Sarah glanced up to see Mrs. Henderson and Mrs. Wilson, two prominent members of the town social circle, settling into the booth directly behind her. She recognized them immediately. Mrs. Henderson ran the local charity foundation, while Mrs. Wilson served on the school board. Both women were known for their strong opinions about proper behavior and family values. Sarah tried to focus on her research about post-traumatic stress in veterans, but the conversation grew increasingly loud and pointed. She couldn't help but overhear as they discussed the recent town council meeting about funding for a new community center. "I just don't understand what this town is coming to," Mrs. Henderson declared, her voice carrying across the cafe. "Did you see that young woman at the grocery store yesterday? Arms covered in those awful tattoos, probably on drugs or involved with some gang." Mrs. Wilson clicked her tongue disapprovingly. "It's disgusting, really. These young people have no respect for themselves or their bodies. And they wonder why they can't find decent jobs. No respectable employer wants to hire someone who looks like they just walked out of a prison." Sarah's fingers tightened around her coffee mug. She'd heard variations of this conversation countless times, but it never got easier. The irony wasn't lost on her. She maintained a perfect 4.0 GPA in her master's program in clinical psychology, had never touched drugs, and spent her weekends volunteering at the local animal shelter. But none of that mattered to people who judged based on appearance alone. "Mark my words," Mrs. Henderson continued. "Tattoos are a sign of poor character and bad decision-making. I would never let my children associate with anyone who had permanently defaced their body like that. It shows a complete lack of foresight and moral judgment." The words stung more than Sarah cared to admit. She pulled her cardigan tighter, ensuring every inch of her tattoo remained hidden. This was exactly why she'd started covering it up when she moved to this conservative small town for graduate school. She learned the hard way that people formed opinions within seconds of seeing her ink, never bothering to learn the story behind it. As she tried to refocus on her laptop screen, Sarah's mind drifted back to the day she'd gotten the tattoo. It wasn't a rebellious teenage decision or a drunken mistake. Every line, every color, every symbol had been carefully chosen to honor something sacred, a promise she'd made to someone who would never come home. The cafe door opened again, bringing in a gust of cool autumn air. Sarah looked up to see a distinguished older man entering. He appeared to be in his 60s, with silver hair and a straight posture that suggested military background. He wore a simple dark jacket and jeans, nothing flashy or attention-grabbing. There was something about his calm demeanor and observant eyes that commanded quiet respect. The man ordered a black coffee and a blueberry muffin at the counter, exchanging pleasant small talk with the barista about the changing weather. His voice was warm but carried an unmistakable tone of authority, the kind that came from years of leadership and responsibility. As he waited for his order, the conversation behind Sarah continued to escalate. Mrs. Wilson had moved on to discussing her daughter's college roommate, who apparently had a small butterfly tattoo on her ankle. "I told Jennifer she needed to request a room change immediately," Mrs. Wilson announced. "I'm not paying good money for her to room with some delinquent who makes such poor life choices. What kind of example is that setting? What kind of influence will that girl have on my daughter?" Mrs. Henderson nodded vigorously. "Absolutely right. These tattooed individuals are often involved in all sorts of unsavory activities. Drugs, promiscuity, criminal behavior. It all goes hand in hand. They have no respect for authority, no sense of honor or duty to their community." Sarah felt her face flush with anger and embarrassment. She wanted to turn around and tell these women exactly how wrong they were, but she knew it wouldn't accomplish anything. In a town this size, creating a scene would only make her life more difficult. She was already the outsider, the graduate student who kept to herself. The last thing she needed was to be labeled as the confrontational girl with tattoos. The distinguished man had been listening to the conversation as well, his expression growing increasingly serious. He collected his coffee and muffin from the counter and, instead of finding his own table, approached the booth where Mrs. Henderson and Mrs. Wilson sat. "Excuse me, ladies," he said politely, his voice respectful but firm. "I couldn't help but overhear your conversation about tattoos and the character of people who have them." Mrs. Henderson looked up, clearly pleased to have an audience for her opinions. She probably assumed this well-dressed gentleman would agree with their position. "Oh yes," she said eagerly. "Isn't it terrible what young people are doing to themselves these days? No sense of decency or self-respect." The man nodded thoughtfully. "I see. So you believe that having tattoos indicates poor character, bad judgment, and lack of honor or duty?" "Absolutely," Mrs. Wilson chimed in. "It's a sign of moral weakness and poor decision-making. People with tattoos are typically involved in criminal activities or other unsavory behaviors. They show no respect for authority or traditional values." Sarah watched the exchange with growing interest. There was something about the man's calm demeanor that suggested he wasn't simply making conversation. His questions seemed purposeful, like he was leading somewhere specific. "That's a fascinating perspective," the man said, maintaining his polite tone. "I suppose you'd feel the same way about anyone in a position of authority who had tattoos? Military personnel, for instance?" Mrs. Henderson waved dismissively. "Well, that's different. Military people have standards, discipline. They wouldn't allow such things. The military teaches respect and honor, values that people with tattoos clearly lack." The conversation had drawn the attention of other cafe patrons. Sarah noticed several people had stopped their own discussions to listen. The barista behind the counter had paused in cleaning glasses, and even the college students at nearby tables were glancing over with curiosity. "I see," the man said again, his expression remaining neutral. "So, in your opinion, someone with visible tattoos could never serve in the military with honor? Could never rise to a position of leadership or command respect from their subordinates?" "Of course not," Mrs. Wilson stated firmly. "The military would never tolerate such behavior. They have standards, unlike these young people today who think they can do whatever they want with their bodies and still expect to be taken seriously." Sarah found herself holding her breath. There was definitely something building here, some point the man was trying to make. His questions were too specific, too pointed to be casual conversation. "What about someone who served multiple tours overseas?" the man continued. "Someone who earned medals for valor, who led troops in combat, who made sacrificial decisions to protect others. If that person had tattoos commemorating their service or honoring fallen comrades, would that change your opinion?" Mrs. Henderson looked slightly less certain, but maintained her stance. "Well, I suppose that would be different, but I doubt such a person exists. Real military heroes don't need to mark up their bodies. Their service speaks for itself." The man smiled slightly, but there was no humor in his expression. "Actually, I'd like you to meet someone who might challenge that assumption." He turned towards Sarah's table, and she realized with surprise that he was looking directly at her. "Miss, would you mind joining our conversation for a moment?" Sarah felt her heart rate spike. She glanced around the cafe, noting that nearly everyone was now watching the unfolding drama. She wanted nothing more than to disappear, but something in the man's eyes, a kind understanding mixed with quiet strength, made her trust him. Slowly, she closed her laptop and stood up. As she walked the few steps to their booth, she could feel the weight of everyone's stares. Mrs. Henderson and Mrs. Wilson looked confused, clearly wondering why this random student was being brought into their conversation. "Ladies," the man said formally, "I'd like you to meet someone whose story might interest you. But first, I think introductions are in order." He extended his hand to Sarah. "I'm Colonel James Mitchell, United States Marine Corps, retired." Sarah shook his hand, immediately understanding that this man knew exactly what he was doing. "Sarah Martinez," she replied quietly. Mrs. Henderson and Mrs. Wilson exchanged glances, looking uncertain for the first time since the conversation began. The word colonel clearly carried weight, even for them. "Now, Sarah," Colonel Mitchell continued, "these ladies have been discussing their views on tattoos and the character of people who have them. They believe that anyone with tattoos lacks honor, discipline, and respect for authority. They also believe that the military would never allow such people to serve, especially in positions of leadership. Sarah felt her stomach clench with anxiety, but Colonel Mitchell's steady presence gave her courage. She had a feeling she knew where this was heading, and while part of her wanted to run, another part was tired of hiding. "I see," she said simply, not sure what else to say. Colonel Michel nodded encourageingly. "Would you mind sharing a bit about yourself? Maybe tell these ladies about your background." Sarah took a deep breath. The entire cafe had gone quiet, and she could feel dozens of eyes on her. This wasn't how she'd planned to spend her Tuesday morning, but somehow it felt like the right moment for truth. "I'm a graduate student in clinical psychology," she began, her voice stronger than she felt. "I'm specializing in trauma therapy for veterans. I maintain a 4.0 GPA and volunteer at the animal shelter on weekends." Mrs. Wilson looked skeptical. "That's very nice, dear, but I'm not sure why the colonel asked you to join our conversation about tattoos and moral character." Sarah glanced at Colonel Mitchell, who nodded encouragingly. "Show them," he said quietly. With trembling hands, Sarah began to unbutton her cardigan. She could hear the sharp intake of breath from several cafe patrons as she rolled up her left sleeve, revealing the intricate tattoo that covered her forearm. The design was breathtaking in its detail and obvious meaning. The military helicopter was rendered with perfect precision, its rotors seeming to move even in the static ink. The poppies surrounding it were vibrant red and incredibly lifelike, symbolizing remembrance and sacrifice. The coordinates beneath were clearly military grid references, and woven throughout the design were subtle elements that spoke of service and lost dog tags, military insignia, and dates that obviously held deep significance. Mrs. Henderson gasped audibly. You have one of those awful tattoos. But you seem so normal." Sarah felt a familiar mix of anger and sadness. "This awful tattoo represents the most important thing in my life," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion behind it. "Every element has meaning. Every line tells a story." "What kind of story?" Mrs. Wilson asked, her previous confidence wavering. Colonel Mitchell stepped closer, his presence commanding attention. "Why don't you tell them about Marcus, Sarah?" At the mention of that name, Sarah's composure nearly broke. She hadn't expected Colonel Mitchell to know about Marcus, but somehow she wasn't surprised. There was something about this man that suggested he understood things others couldn't see. "Marcus was my brother," Sarah said, her voice becoming softer but more intense. "He was a Marine helicopter pilot. 3 tours in Afghanistan. He was supposed to come home for good in 2018. The cafe had become so quiet that the only sound was the gentle hum of the espresso machine. Even the college students had put down their phones to listen. "He was leading a medical evacuation mission," Sarah continued, touching the helicopter in her tattoo gently. "A unit had been ambushed, and there were casualties who needed immediate extraction. The landing zone was hot. Enemy fire from multiple positions." Mrs. Henderson shifted uncomfortably in her seat, beginning to realize that this story was heading somewhere she hadn't expected. "Marcus could have waited for air support to clear the area," Sarah said. "That would have been the safe protocol. But the wounded Marines would have died waiting. So he made the choice to go in anyway." Colonel Mitchell watched Sarah with obvious respect and understanding. This was clearly a story he'd heard variations of many times throughout his career. "The coordinates of my tattoo marked the spot where his helicopter went down," Sarah continued. "He saved 6 Marines that day, got them all out safely before taking enemy fire. He didn't make it home." The silence in the cafe was profound. Mrs. Wilson stared at the tattoo with completely different eyes, seeing not a mark of rebellion, but a memorial of sacrifice. "The poppies represent remembrance," Sarah explained. "In military tradition, they honor those who gave their lives in service. The dates woven into the design mark important moments. When Marcus enlisted, when he earned his wings, when he was promoted to captain, and," her voice caught slightly, "when he died saving others." Mrs. Henderson looked pale. I had no idea. I'm so sorry for your loss." Colonel Mitchell placed a gentle hand on Sarah's shoulder. "Sarah got this tattoo not as an act of rebellion, but as a promise. Would you like to tell them about the promise, Sarah?" Sarah nodded, feeling stronger with each word. "I promised Marcus, at his funeral, that I would dedicate my life to helping veterans who come home with invisible wounds. That's why I'm studying trauma therapy. Every day I look at this tattoo, I remember why I'm doing this work. It's not decoration. It's a daily reminder of purpose and sacrifice. The transformation in the two women's expressions was remarkable. What had started as disdain and judgment had become something approaching shame and respect. Furthermore, Colonel Mitchell added, his voice carrying new authority, Sarah isn't the only one in this cafe with tattoos that tell a story of service and sacrifice. With deliberate movements, he began to unzip his dark jacket. As the fabric parted, both women gasped at what they saw underneath. Colonel Mitchell's jacket fell open to reveal a sight that left the entire cafe speechless. His arms, from wrist to shoulder, were covered in an intricate tapestry of military tattoos. Each piece was a masterwork of artistry and meaning, telling the story of a distinguished career that spanned decades of service to his country. On his right arm, an eagle perched atop a globe, and Anchor, the Marine Corps emblem, rendered in stunning detail with spread wings that seemed ready to take flight. Beneath it, unit insignias from various deployments created a chronological map of his service. 1st Marine Expeditionary Force, 2nd Battalion 5th Marines, Marine Aircraft Group 16. Each insignia represented months or years of his life dedicated to leading Marines in some of the most challenging circumstances imaginable. His left arm told an even more profound story. A memorial sleeve dedicated to fallen comrades stretched from his wrist to his shoulder. Names were woven through banners and scrolls, each one representing a Marine who had served under his command and paid the ultimate price. Dates marked battles and operations that most civilians only read about in history books. Fallujah, Helmand Province, Marja. The artistry was breathtaking, but the meaning behind each element was what truly commanded respect. Mrs. Henderson stared in complete shock, her mouth slightly agape. This wasn't some young rebel making poor choices. This was a decorated military officer whose ink told the story of a lifetime of service and sacrifice. The carefully crafted narrative she'd built about tattoos and character crumbled before her eyes. "Colonel," Mrs. Wilson stammered, we had no idea." Mitchell rolled up his sleeves fully, revealing even more detail. On his forearms, combat action ribbons had been recreated in stunning color and precision. The Purple Heart, Bronze Star, Silver Star, each medal earned through valor and sacrifice, now permanently etched into his skin as reminders of moments when he'd been tested and proven worthy. These tattoos, Mitchell said calmly, represent 32 years of active duty service. 3 wars, countless deployments, and more difficult decisions than I care to remember. Each piece was carefully planned and executed by some of the finest tattoo artists in the country, many of them veterans themselves who understand the significance of what they're creating. Sarah watched the colonel's revelation with a mixture of gratitude and amazement. She'd never seen such an extensive collection of military ink, and the respect it commanded was evident in every face around the cafe. Students who had been casually listening were now standing to get a better view, their expressions showing newfound understanding. "This particular piece," Mitchell said, pointing to a detailed portrait on his upper right arm, "honors my first platoon sergeant, Gunnery Sergeant Rodriguez. He taught me more about leadership in 6 months than I learned in 4 years at the Naval Academy. He was killed by an IED in Iraq in 2004 while attempting to rescue wounded Marines from a disabled vehicle. The detail in the portrait was extraordinary. Every line of the gunny's face captured with photographic precision, surrounded by elements that represented his service and sacrifice. It wasn't just a tattoo. It was a work of art that served as a living memorial. And this," he continued, indicating a section of his left arm that featured a helicopter similar to the one in Sarah's tattoo, "commemorates a medical evacuation mission in Afghanistan where we lost 3 good Marines trying to save a wounded Afghan child. The pilot, Captain Williams, was posthumously awarded the Navy Cross for his actions that day." Mrs. Henderson shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Every assumption she'd made about tattoos and the people who wore them was being systematically dismantled by the evidence before her eyes. This wasn't about rebellion or poor judgment. It was about honor, memory, and the deeply personal ways that warriors chose to carry their experiences. "You see, ladies," Mitchell continued, his tone remaining respectful but firm, "in the military community, tattoos often serve a very different purpose than you might assume. They're not fashion statements or acts of defiance. They're living memorials, promises, and reminders of what we've experienced and what we've lost. He gestured towards Sarah, who was still standing beside the booth with her own tattoo visible. Sarah's ink tells the story of her brother's sacrifice and her commitment to honor his memory through service to others. My tattoos tell the story of Marines I've led, battles I've fought, and brothers I've lost. Neither of us got these tattoos to look tough or rebellious. We got them because some experiences are so profound that they become part of who you are. A young college student from a nearby table approached hesitantly. "Excuse me, sir," he said respectfully. "My dad served in Iraq. He has tattoos too, similar to yours." I never really understood them before, but he trailed off, clearly moved by what he'd witnessed. Mitchell smiled at the young man. "Your father's ink probably tells stories he may never share with you directly. For many veterans, tattoos become a way to carry their service with them, to ensure that the sacrifices made, both their own and those of their comrades, are never forgotten." Sarah found her voice again. "When I first moved to this town for graduate school, I started covering my tattoo because of reactions like the one we heard earlier. I was tired of being judged before people knew anything about me or what my ink represents." Mrs. Wilson looked genuinely ashamed now. "Sarah, dear, I owe you a sincere apology. I made assumptions that were completely unfair and uninformed." "The problem," Mitchell said, settling into the booth opposite the two women, "is that these assumptions cause real harm. Veterans returning from deployment often struggle with reintegration into civilian society. When they're judged negatively for tattoos that represent their service, it creates additional barriers to employment, education, and community acceptance." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a business card, sliding it across the table to Mrs. Henderson. "I currently serve as Director of Veteran Affairs for the county. Part of my job involves helping veterans navigate exactly these kinds of challenges. We've documented dozens of cases where qualified veterans were passed over for jobs or treated differently because of tattoos related to their service." Mrs. Henderson examined the business card with obvious surprise. Colonel James Mitchell, Director of Veterans Affairs, decorated Marine Corps veteran, community leader, and someone whose extensive tattoos had just challenged everything she thought she knew about the relationship between appearance and character. "In fact," Mitchell continued, "some of the most dedicated, honorable people I know have significant tattoo coverage. Military personnel, first responders, healthcare workers who serve in combat zones. Ink often correlates with service and sacrifice, not with the negative characteristics you assumed." Sarah felt emboldened by the colonel's support. "I've been volunteering at the animal shelter for 2 years now," she said. "Mrs. Henderson, you actually presented me with a volunteer appreciation award last spring. You probably don't remember because my tattoo was covered, but you praised my dedication and work ethic." Mrs. Henderson's eyes widened with recognition. "You're the young woman who organized the fundraiser for the new kennel facilities. You raised over $3,000 and coordinated dozens of volunteers. That was extraordinary work." "The same person," Sarah confirmed. "The tattoo didn't change my character or work ethic. It's been there the whole time, representing my brother's sacrifice and my commitment to helping others. The only thing that changed was your perception when you could see it." A middle-aged man from another table stood up and approached their booth. He was wearing a simple plaid shirt and jeans, looking like any other local resident. "Excuse me," he said, addressing Mitchell. "I couldn't help but overhear your conversation. I'm Chief of Police Tom Bradley, and I wanted to say something if that's okay." Mitchell nodded encouragingly. "Of course, Chief." Bradley rolled up his own sleeves, revealing tattoos that clearly identified him as a former Marine. 20 years in the Corps before I became a police officer," he explained to the now fascinated audience. "Some of my best officers and deputies have tattoos related to their military service. In fact, I specifically recruit veterans because they bring discipline, courage, and a sense of duty that's invaluable in law enforcement." Mrs. Wilson looked around the cafe with new eyes, probably wondering how many other people she'd misjudged based on appearance alone. "Chief Bradley, I had no idea you'd serve in the military." "Most people don't," Bradley replied. "Like Colonel Mitchell said, veterans don't always advertise their service. But we carry it with us in various ways. For some, that includes tattoos that commemorate significant experiences or honor fallen comrades. Sarah watched the transformation happening in real time. A conversation that had started with harsh judgment and stereotype was evolving into education and understanding. She felt a sense of validation she hadn't experienced since moving to this town. Mitchell reached for his coffee, which had grown cold during the intense conversation. The point we're trying to make, ladies, isn't that all tattoos are meaningful or that everyone who has them is a hero. The point is that appearance alone tells you nothing about a person's character, values, or contributions to society. Furthermore, Sarah added, feeling more confident, the assumption that people with tattoos lack respect for authority is particularly ironic. Military service is built on respect for authority, chain of command, and following orders even in life-threatening situations. Yet many of the most disciplined, authority-respecting people in our society choose to commemorate their service with tattoos. A woman at the counter had been listening intently and now approached the group. She wore scrubs, clearly coming from or going to medical shift. "I'm Dr. Jennifer Walsh from the county hospital," she said. "I wanted to add something to this conversation, if you don't mind." Mitchell gestured for her to continue. "I'm a trauma surgeon, and I work with a lot of veterans who come through our emergency department," Dr. Walsh explained. "Some of the most dedicated, reliable, and skilled medical professionals I know have tattoos related to their service. We have nurses, technicians, and even physicians who serve in combat zones, and chose to commemorate that experience with meaningful ink." She paused, looking directly at Mrs. Henderson and Mrs. Wilson. "These are people who save lives every day, who work incredibly long hours under tremendous pressure, and who bring skills learned in military medicine to benefit our civilian population. To dismiss them as having poor character based on their tattoos would be both inaccurate and harmful to our community." The cafe had become an impromptu town hall meeting, with nearly everyone listening to the conversation and many sharing their own experiences or observations. Sarah realized that this moment was bigger than just defending her own tattoo. It was about challenging widespread misconceptions that affected entire communities of veterans and other groups who chose to express meaningful experiences through body art. "Dr. Walsh makes an excellent point," Mitchell said. "The skills, discipline, and experience that veterans bring to civilian careers are invaluable. When we create barriers based on appearance, we're potentially excluding some of our most qualified and dedicated community members." Mrs. Henderson sat quietly for several moments, clearly processing everything she'd heard and seen. Finally, she spoke. "Colonel Mitchell, Sarah, I owe you both a profound apology. And, honestly, I owe an apology to anyone else I may have judged unfairly based on their appearance." "The important thing," Sarah replied graciously, "is that we're having this conversation now. Education and understanding can help prevent these assumptions in the future." Mitchell nodded approvingly at Sarah's response. "That's exactly the attitude that will help heal these divisions in our communities. We don't expect everyone to suddenly love tattoos or get them themselves. We just ask that people reserve judgment until they know the story behind the ink." The college student who had mentioned his father earlier raised his hand tentatively. "Colonel, can I ask how someone learns to tell the difference between meaningful tattoos and, well, ones that might not be?" It was an honest question that got to the heart of the complexity involved in changing long-held assumptions. Colonel Mitchell smiled at the young man's question, appreciating its honesty and thoughtfulness. "That's actually a very insightful question," he replied. "The truth is, you can't always tell just by looking at a tattoo whether it has deep meaning or not. And, frankly, that's exactly why we shouldn't judge people based on their ink at all." He gestured toward his own elaborate sleeve. "Even these tattoos, which clearly have military significance, could theoretically belong to someone who never served but just liked the aesthetic. Without knowing the person's story, you're still making assumptions based on appearance." Sarah nodded in agreement. "That's why I've learned to share the story behind my tattoo when people seem genuinely interested in understanding. It's not the tattoo itself that matters. It's the experience and commitment it represents." Dr. Walsh, who had remained nearby listening to the conversation, added her perspective. "In the medical field, we've learned that the most important thing is to treat each person as an individual. I've worked with tattooed veterans who were among the most professional, dedicated people I've ever known, and I've worked with people in suits who lacked basic integrity. Character isn't visible from the outside." Mrs. Wilson shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "I'm beginning to realize how many people I may have misjudged over the years. It's embarrassing to think about some of the assumptions I've made. Don't be too hard on yourself, Sarah said kindly. We all make quick judgments sometimes. The important thing is being willing to reconsider when we learn new information. Chief Bradley, who had been quietly observing the conversation, spoke up again. In law enforcement, we call it unconscious bias. Everyone has it to some degree. It's how our brains try to quickly categorize information. The key is recognizing it and actively working to counteract it. An elderly gentleman at a corner table had been listening intently and now stood up slowly, walking over to the group with the aid of a cane. He wore a simple button-down shirt and khakis, looking like any other retiree enjoying his morning coffee. "Excuse me," he said in a quiet but clear voice. "I'm Frank Thompson. I served in Vietnam, came home in 1971. I wanted to share something that might add to this conversation." Mitchell immediately stood and extended his hand respectfully. "Honored to meet you, sir." "What branch?" "Army, 1st Cavalry Division," Thompson replied, shaking Mitchell's hand firmly. "Spent 13 months in country. Came home to a very different reception than what you folks received after Iraq and Afghanistan." The cafe fell silent again as Thompson continued. "When I came back from Vietnam, having visible tattoos could get you fired from most jobs. Not because people thought they represented poor character, but because they marked you as a veteran, and Vietnam veterans weren't exactly popular in the early 70s. Sarah listened with fascination. She'd read about the treatment of Vietnam veterans in her studies, but hearing it firsthand from someone who'd lived it was different. "I got a small eagle tattoo while I was overseas," Thompson continued, rolling up his sleeve to reveal a faded but still recognizable design on his forearm. "When I got home, I had to keep it covered for 30 years. Couldn't risk anyone knowing I'd served, because it would have cost me job opportunities, social acceptance, everything." Mrs. Henderson looked shocked. "Mr. Thompson, I had no idea you were a veteran. You've lived in this town for, what, 20 years? 23, Thompson confirmed. "And until today, I've never shown this tattoo to anyone here except my wife and doctor. The shame and stigma I felt about my service took decades to overcome." Mitchell's expression grew serious. "Mr. Thompson, first let me say thank you for your service. Second, I want you to know that the way Vietnam veterans were treated was a national disgrace that we've worked hard to ensure never happens again." "I know that," Thompson said with a slight smile, "and I appreciate how you folks have been received. It gives me hope that maybe things really have changed. But listening to this conversation today made me realize that even now, people are quick to judge veterans based on visible signs of their service." Sarah felt a deep sadness hearing Thompson's story. "Sir, I can't imagine having to hide something that represents your service and sacrifice. That must have been incredibly isolating." Thompson nodded. "It was. But what I learned over the years is that prejudice often comes from fear and misunderstanding. People weren't really judging me. They were reacting to ideas they had about Vietnam veterans that were largely based on media portrayals and political rhetoric." The college student who had asked the earlier question raised his hand again. "Mr. Thompson, if you don't mind me asking, what changed? How'd you get past feeling like you had to hide your service?" Thompson considered the question carefully. "Time helped. But more importantly, I started meeting other veterans who were open about their service. I realized that hiding wasn't protecting me. It was preventing me from connecting with people who might understand my experience." He looked directly at Sarah and Mitchell. "That's why what you two did today was so important. By standing up to ignorance with education and personal stories, you're creating space for understanding instead of judgment." Dr. Walsh checked her watch and realized she needed to get to her shift, but she didn't want to leave without contributing one more thought. "This conversation has made me think about all the assumptions we make in healthcare, too. I've seen colleagues dismiss patients with tattoos as drug seekers or assume they're non-compliant with treatment, when in reality, some of those patients are veterans dealing with service-related injuries or trauma. That's a serious problem," Mitchell acknowledged. "Veterans' healthcare outcomes suffer when medical professionals bring bias into the treatment room. Tattoos related to military service can actually be valuable indicators that a patient might be dealing with service-connected conditions." Mrs. Henderson had been unusually quiet during this part of the conversation, clearly processing everything she'd learned. Finally, she spoke up. "Colonel Mitchell, is there anything our community could be doing better to support veterans? I sit on several boards and committees, and honestly, this conversation has made me realize we might be inadvertently creating barriers? Mitchell appreciated the question and the genuine desire for improvement it represented. Actually, yes. One of the biggest challenges veterans face is employment discrimination based on appearance, including tattoos. Many employers automatically disqualify candidates with visible tattoos without considering their qualifications or the meaning behind the ink. What can we do about that? Mrs. Wilson asked, also seeming genuinely interested in making positive changes. Education, primarily, Sarah answered. Helping employers understand that veterans often have tattoos related to their service, and that those tattoos actually indicate positive qualities like loyalty, honor, and commitment to something greater than themselves. Chief Bradley nodded in agreement. We've started including this in our diversity training for new hires. We talk about recognizing military tattoos and understanding what they represent so our officers don't make assumptions about people they encounter in the community. Thompson spoke up again. In all my years living here, this is the first time I've heard this kind of open, honest discussion about veterans and community acceptance. It gives me hope that maybe other veterans won't have to hide parts of their experience the way I did. Mitchell pulled out his phone and scrolled through some information. Actually, Mr. Thompson raises a good point about hidden veterans in our communities. According to our latest county data, we have over 1,200 veterans living in this area, but most community members couldn't identify more than a handful of them. Why is that? The college student asked. Because many veterans, especially those from earlier eras like Mr. Thompson, learn to blend in rather than stand out, Mitchell explained. They don't wear military-branded clothing, they don't talk about their service, and they certainly don't display tattoos or other indicators that might lead to judgment or unwanted attention. Sarah felt inspired by the direction the conversation was taking. This is exactly why I'm studying trauma therapy for veterans. So many are dealing with experiences they feel they can't share because of societal attitudes and misconceptions. Sarah, Mrs. Henderson said thoughtfully, you mentioned earlier that you volunteer at the animal shelter. Are you aware that we have several veteran programs that could probably use someone with your background and passion? I'd be very interested in learning about those, Sarah replied enthusiastically. Mitchell smiled at the developing connection. Mrs. Henderson, if you're serious about wanting to help the veteran community, I'd love to discuss some partnership opportunities. We're always looking for community leaders who are willing to advocate for veteran-friendly policies and programs. I am absolutely serious, Mrs. Henderson said firmly. This conversation has been eye-opening in ways I couldn't have imagined. I realize now that my assumptions weren't just harmless opinions. They were potentially harmful prejudices that could affect real people in real ways. Mrs. Wilson nodded in agreement. I keep thinking about what Sarah said about promising to help veterans with invisible wounds. Here we've been adding to those wounds with our ignorant comments about tattoos and character. Thompson leaned heavily on his cane, but straightened his shoulders with obvious pride. Ladies, the fact that you're willing to acknowledge your mistakes and commit to doing better means more than you might realize. That kind of growth and openness is exactly what this community needs. The cafe had gradually returned to its normal buzz of conversation, but several people were still clearly listening to their discussion. Sarah noticed that other patrons were looking at her tattoo with curiosity rather than judgment now, and a few had even nodded approvingly when they caught her eye. Dr. Walsh, who had been checking her phone repeatedly, finally stood to leave for a shift. Before I go, I want to say something to everyone here. This conversation has reminded me why I love working in this community. When people are willing to listen, learn, and grow, amazing things can happen. She looked directly at Sarah. And, Sarah, if you ever decide to pursue medical school after your psychology degree, please consider emergency medicine. We need people who understand trauma and can connect with veteran patients. Sarah felt a warm glow of possibility. Thank you, Dr. Walsh. I'll definitely consider that. As Dr. Walsh left, Mitchell turned to address the broader group that had formed around their booth. I think what we've demonstrated here today is that most misunderstandings can be resolved through honest conversation and willingness to listen. We don't have to agree on everything, but we can choose to approach each other with respect and open minds. The college student raised his hand one more time. Colonel, would it be appropriate for someone like me, who hasn't served, to get a tattoo honoring veterans? I never want to pretend I served, but I have a lot of respect for people who did. It was a thoughtful question that showed how much the young man had absorbed from the conversation. Mitchell considered his answer carefully. That's a respectful question, and I appreciate that you're thinking about it thoughtfully. There are definitely ways to honor military service without misrepresenting your own experience. The key is making sure any design clearly indicates your role as a supporter rather than implying you serve yourself. Thompson smiled at the young man. Son, the fact that you want to honor veterans means a lot. Just make sure you understand what you're representing, and never let anyone assume you served if you didn't. Sarah felt overwhelmed by the positive turn the conversation had taken. What had started as another instance of hurtful judgment had become a community dialogue about understanding, respect, and growth. She looked around a cafe and realized that something significant had happened here, not just for her, but for everyone who had participated in or witnessed the exchange. Over the following weeks, the conversation at Miller's coffee shop seemed to have planted seeds throughout the community that grew in unexpected and beautiful ways. Sarah found herself at the center of changes she never could have imagined when she'd walked into that cafe, just trying to study in peace. 3 days after the incident, Mrs. Henderson called Sarah directly. Dear, I've been thinking about our conversation, and I wonder if you'd be willing to speak at our next Charity Foundation board meeting. We're planning our spring fundraising campaign, and I think the veteran community deserves our attention and support. Sarah was surprised, but pleased. I'd be honored to speak, Mrs. Henderson. What did you have in mind? Well, Colonel Mitchell sent me some information about veteran programs that need funding, and I realized we've been overlooking an entire population in our community that could benefit from our resources. Veterans dealing with trauma, homelessness, unemployment. These are exactly the kinds of issues our foundation was created to address. The following Tuesday, Sarah found herself standing before a room of prominent community leaders, many of whom had probably shared Mrs. Henderson's original views about tattoos and the people who wore them. She wore a sleeveless blouse, her memorial tattoo clearly visible, and spoke passionately about the needs of veterans transitioning back to civilian life. When my brother died serving our country, she told the assembled board members, I made a promise to dedicate my life to helping veterans who come home with invisible wounds. But I've learned that some of the biggest barriers these veterans face aren't created by their trauma. They're created by community attitudes and assumptions that prevent them from accessing employment, housing, and social support. The presentation was a resounding success. The foundation committed $50,000 to veteran programs with a focus on mental health services and job training initiatives. More importantly, several board members approached Sarah afterward to share their own connections to military service, family members, friends, and in one case, hidden personal experience that had never been discussed publicly. Meanwhile, Colonel Mitchell had been busy implementing changes at the county level. He organized a series of community education sessions about veteran issues, with Sarah serving as one of the primary speakers. The sessions drew unexpectedly large crowds, including many business owners interested in learning how to better recruit and support veteran employees. At one particularly well-attended session, a local factory manager stood up during the question period. I'll be honest, he said, I've passed over job applicants with visible tattoos because I assumed they'd be trouble. After hearing these presentations, I realize I've probably discriminated against some of the most qualified, disciplined people in the job market. It's not too late to change those policies, Mitchell replied. In fact, many companies are actively recruiting veterans now because they recognize the value that military experience brings to the workplace. The manager nodded thoughtfully. We're revising our hiring policies immediately. And if any of those veterans I turn away are still looking for work, I'd like to contact them and make it right. Sarah watched these exchanges with amazement. The ripple effects of that single conversation in the coffee shop were spreading far beyond anything she'd expected. Veterans who had been hiding their service were starting to connect with each other and with community resources. Employers were reconsidering their assumptions. Community leaders were prioritizing veteran issues in ways they never had before. One evening, while Sarah was working late in the university library, she received a text from an unknown number. Hi, this is Mark Stevens. I heard about your presentation to the Charity Foundation. I'm a veteran who's been struggling to find work here. Could we talk sometime? Sarah immediately called the number. Mark turned out to be a former Army medic who had served 3 tours in Afghanistan and had been unemployed for 8 months since moving to town. He had extensive medical training, but had been repeatedly rejected for healthcare positions, partly due to visible tattoos on his hands and forearms. I started to think maybe I should just move somewhere else, Mark told her during their phone conversation. I felt like this town wasn't ready for someone like me. Don't give up yet, Sarah urged. Let me connect you with some people. Things are starting to change here. She immediately called Dr. Walsh at the hospital, who was thrilled to learn about Mark's medical background. Send me his resume immediately, Dr. Walsh said. We desperately need experienced medical personnel, and his combat medic training would be incredibly valuable in our trauma unit. Within a week, Mark had not only been hired at the hospital, but had been offered a position that would allow him to use his specialized trauma experience while pursuing additional civilian medical certifications. When he started work, his tattoos, which included medical symbols and memorials to fellow medics killed in action, became conversation starters that helped him connect with colleagues and patients alike. The success stories began to multiply. Chief Bradley implemented a veteran preference hiring policy for the police department, specifically noting that military tattoos would be considered evidence of service rather than ground for disqualification. The fire department followed suit, recognizing that many veterans had exactly the kind of emergency response experience they needed. Frank Thompson, the Vietnam veteran who had shared his story at the coffee shop, became an unexpected community advocate. He started attending city council meetings and speaking about veteran issues, his small eagle tattoo now visible on his rolled-up sleeves as a badge of honor rather than something to hide. For 40 years, I felt ashamed of my service, he told the city council during a meeting about veteran housing initiatives. But this community has shown me that it's possible for attitudes to change and for veterans to be welcomed home properly, even decades after we first returned. The city council unanimously approved funding for a new veteran housing program, with Thompson serving as an advisory board member. Sarah's graduate advisor, Dr. Patricia Coleman, was fascinated by the community changes she was witnessing. Sarah, this is exactly the kind of systemic change that trauma therapy aims to create, she told her during one of their weekly meetings. You're not just helping individual veterans, you're changing the community environment that affects their recovery and integration. I never expected it to grow this big, Sarah admitted. I just wanted people to understand what my tattoo represented. That's often how the most significant changes begin, Dr. Coleman replied. One person willing to be vulnerable and authentic can create space for everyone to be more honest and understanding. The ripple effects reached into unexpected areas. The local community college developed a new program specifically designed to help veterans translate their military experience into civilian career skills. The program's logo, designed by a veteran student, incorporated tasteful military imagery, including stylized tattoo-inspired elements. Mrs. Wilson, who had been one of the most vocal critics in that original coffee shop conversation, became one of the program's biggest supporters. She served on the advisory committee and often spoke about her own transformation. I learned that my assumptions weren't just wrong. They were harmful, she told a group of new program participants. Veterans deserve our respect and support, not our judgment. I'm committed to making sure this community becomes a place where all veterans feel valued and welcomed. One of the most touching developments came when several local tattoo artists reached out to Colonel Mitchell about offering free or discounted memorial tattoos for veterans. They had been moved by the stories they'd heard and wanted to contribute to the healing process. We never really understood the significance of military tattoos before, explained Jake Morrison, owner of Ink and Honor Tattoo Studio. Now we realize that we have the privilege of helping veterans create permanent memorials to their service and their fallen brothers and sisters. It's sacred work, and we want to do it right. The shop began specializing in military memorial pieces, with artists trained to understand military symbolism and the emotional weight of the tattoos they were creating. They partnered with local veteran organizations to ensure that their work honored military traditions appropriately. Sarah was invited to speak at the shop's grand reopening, where she shared the story of her own tattoo and its meaning. The event drew veterans from throughout the region, many of whom had been hiding their own meaningful ink for years. Today marks more than the reopening of a business, Sarah told the gathered crowd. It represents a community that has chosen understanding over judgment, inclusion over exclusion. It represents a place where veterans can honor their service openly and proudly. As autumn progressed, Sarah noticed changes in her daily life that went far beyond the formal programs and initiatives. People in the grocery store, at the gas station, and around campus would nod respectfully when they saw her tattoo instead of staring with judgment. Some would even approach her to share their own connections to military service or to thank her for her advocacy work. One particularly meaningful encounter came when she was volunteering at the animal shelter. A young woman with small military tattoos on her wrists brought in a stray dog she'd found, and they began talking about their shared experiences as female veterans' family members. "I've been thinking about getting my grandfather's unit patch tattooed," the woman shared. "He served in World War II, but never talked about it much. He passed away last year, and I found his old military papers. I want to honor his service somehow." Sarah helped her research the appropriate design elements and connected her with Jake's tattoo shop, where they specialized in historical military pieces. The resulting tattoo became another bridge between past and present, honoring service across generations. The most significant moment came on Veterans Day, when the town organized its first ever Veterans Recognition ceremony. Sarah was asked to be the keynote speaker, and as she looked out at the crowd of hundreds gathered in the town square, she was amazed by the diversity of people in attendance. Veterans from every era of service were there, many proudly displaying tattoos that told their stories. Community members who had never understood military culture before were learning about different traditions and symbols. Families were sharing stories that had been kept private for decades. Mrs. Henderson introduced Sarah, mentioning her own transformation from someone who judged veterans based on their tattoos to someone who had learned to see the honor and sacrifice behind the ink. The introduction drew applause from veterans and civilians alike. "Well, I got this tattoo," Sarah said, touching her memorial piece. "I thought it was just for me and Marcus, a way to keep my promise to him and carry his memory forward. I never imagined that sharing its story would help change an entire community's understanding of service and sacrifice." She paused, looking out at the crowd of faces that had become familiar over the past few months. "But I've learned that healing, whether individual or community healing, happens when we're willing to be vulnerable with each other, to share our stories, and to listen with open hearts and minds." The ceremony concluded with a moment of silence for fallen service members, followed by the presentation of community service awards to veterans who had contributed to local organizations. Mark Stevens, the former medic who was now thriving at the hospital, received recognition for his work in the trauma unit. Frank Thompson was honored for his advocacy work. Colonel Mitchell was thanked for his leadership in bridging military and civilian communities. As the crowd began to disperse, Sarah felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned to see a teenage girl with her parents, all of whom looked nervous but determined. "Ms. Martinez," the girl said, "my brother is deploying to overseas next month. I wanted to ask you about getting a tattoo to support him while he's gone. Something that would show I'm proud of his service, but also show that I'm thinking about him every day." Sarah smiled warmly at the family. "That's a beautiful way to support your brother. Let's talk about some options that would be meaningful for both of you." As they talked, Sarah realized that the conversation in Miller's coffee shop had started something that would continue growing long after she finished her graduate program and moved on to her career. The community had learned to see past surface judgments to the stories and character underneath. Veterans had found their voices and their place in the community, and families like this one were finding ways to honor service while building understanding across generational and cultural divides. The change hadn't happened overnight, and it hadn't been easy, but it had been real, profound, and lasting. And it had all started with one person being willing to show their tattoo and share its story with strangers who needed to hear it. 2 years after that transformative morning at Miller's coffee shop, Sarah Martinez stood at the podium of the university's graduation ceremony, preparing to receive her master's degree in clinical psychology. The audience included not just her family and friends, but a remarkable collection of people whose lives had intersected with hers through the journey that began with judgment and blossomed into understanding. Mrs. Henderson sat in the third row, wearing a small pin on her lapel that featured the coordinates from Sarah's tattoo, a memorial piece she had made to honor Marcus and all fallen service members. Beside her sat Mrs. Wilson, who had become one of the most effective veteran advocates in the county, her transformation from critic to champion complete and genuine. Colonel Mitchell occupied a place of honor on the platform, as he would be presenting Sarah with a special recognition award for her community service work. His own tattoos were visible beneath his dress uniform sleeves, now seen by everyone in attendance as symbols of honor and sacrifice rather than marks of questionable character. Frank Thompson had brought his entire extended family, including grandchildren who now knew every detail of his Vietnam service and wore their grandfather's military patches with pride. He'd become something of a local celebrity, speaking at schools about both veteran issues and the importance of not judging people based on appearances. Mark Stevens sat with his wife and young daughter, wearing his hospital scrubs with obvious pride. He'd been promoted to senior trauma technician and was pursuing advanced medical training with the hospital support. His military tattoos were now seen as credentials rather than barriers, marking him as someone with the kind of experience that saved lives daily. As Sarah approached the podium to deliver the student address, she touched the memorial tattoo on her arm, a habit she developed whenever she needed to feel connected to Marcus and the promise she'd made to him. Today, that tattoo was fully visible in her sleeveless graduation gown, displayed proudly for hundreds to see. "When I started this graduate program," Sarah began, her voice carrying clearly through the auditorium, "I thought I was here simply to gain the credentials necessary to help veterans dealing with trauma. I covered my tattoo, kept my head down, and focused on my studies. I had no idea that my education would extend far beyond textbooks and clinical training into the realm of community healing and social change." She paused, making eye contact with the familiar faces in the audience who had been part of her unexpected journey. "I learned that healing isn't just an individual process, it's a community endeavor. When we judge people based on appearance, when we make assumptions about character without understanding stories, we create environments that impede healing rather than promote it. But when we choose curiosity over judgment, when we listen to stories instead of making assumptions, remarkable transformation becomes possible." In the audience, Dr. Walsh smiled from her seat near the back. She'd just finished a shift at the hospital, where she now supervised a veteran-focused trauma team that had become a model for other medical facilities. The team included several staff members with military tattoos, whose visible ink had become a source of connection and trust with veteran patients. Chief Bradley nodded approvingly from his seat in the law enforcement section. His police department had not only changed their hiring policies, but had become a recruiting destination for veteran officers throughout the region. The department's community policing initiatives now included specific outreach to veteran populations, breaking down barriers that had existed for decades. "Today, our community looks different than it did 2 years ago," Sarah continued. "Veterans who are hiding their service are now proudly contributing their skills and experience. Employers who once discriminated based on appearance now actively recruit based on character and capability. Community leaders who once made assumptions now make efforts to understand and include." She gestured toward the veterans section of the audience, where dozens of men and women sat proudly displaying tattoos that told stories of service, sacrifice, and survival. But the most important change isn't in policies or programs. It's in perspective. We've learned to see past the surface to the substance, to value story over stereotype, to choose understanding over assumption. Jake Morrison, the tattoo artist who had transformed his shop into a veteran memorial studio, sat with several of his clients whose tattoos had become conversation starters rather than conversation enders. His business had tripled as word spread about his commitment to honoring military service through meaningful art. He'd also started teaching workshops about military symbology to other tattoo artists throughout the state. "The lessons we've learned extend far beyond veteran issues," Sarah said. "They apply to every situation where we're tempted to judge based on appearance. Every moment when we have the choice between assumption and inquiry, every opportunity to build bridges instead of barriers." In the family section, Sarah's parents sat with tears of pride in their eyes. They'd driven across 3 states to attend her graduation, and they'd spent the previous evening meeting the community members who had become so important to their daughter's journey. Her mother wore a small pin featuring Marcus's helicopter unit insignia, finally able to publicly honor the son she'd lost and the daughter who was carrying forward his legacy. Dr. Coleman, Sarah's advisor, watched with satisfaction as her former student demonstrated the kind of leadership and communication skills that would serve her well in her planned doctoral program. Sarah had been accepted to several prestigious PhD programs in trauma psychology, but had chosen to stay local to continue her community work while pursuing advanced training. "As I move forward to the next phase of my education and career," Sarah continued, "I carry with me not just academic knowledge, but the profound understanding that healing happens in relationship between therapist and client, between community members, between people who choose to see each other's humanity despite surface differences." The teenage girl who had approached Sarah after the Veterans Day ceremony 2 years earlier now sat in the audience wearing her own small tattoo, a delicate design that incorporated her brother's unit patch and a quote about courage. Her brother had returned safely from deployment and was now studying engineering at the same university, planning to use his military benefits to build a civilian career. To my fellow graduates, Sarah said, whatever field you enter, whatever challenges you face, remember that you have the power to choose understanding over judgment, inclusion over exclusion, bridge building over barrier construction. The smallest acts of openness and courage can create ripples of change that extend far beyond what you can imagine. She touched her tattoo again, feeling the presence of Marcus and all the fallen service members whose sacrifices had created the foundation for her life's work. To the community members who welcomed me and taught me that growth is possible at any age, in any circumstance, thank you for showing me that change begins with individuals willing to examine their assumptions and adjust their perspectives. You created a model that other communities can follow. The applause began slowly but built to a sustained ovation as audience members rose to their feet. But Sarah wasn't finished. Finally, to the veterans in our community and everywhere, your service matters, your sacrifices are honored, and your stories deserve to be heard and understood. The tattoos you wear, whether they commemorate service, honor fallen comrades, or mark significant moments in your journey, are badges of honor that deserve respect, not judgment. She paused for the emotional moment, looking directly at Frank Thompson, whose small eagle tattoo was now displayed proudly on his rolled-up sleeves. My brother Marcus died saving other Marines because he believed that service meant putting others before yourself, that honor meant keeping your promises even when it cost everything. The promise I made to him, to dedicate my life to helping veterans heal, has expanded into something I never could have envisioned. It's become a promise to help communities heal, to build understanding across differences, to create spaces where everyone's story can be heard and valued. As she concluded her address, Sarah announced the establishment of the Marcus Martinez Memorial Foundation, funded through the success of various community initiatives and dedicated to supporting veteran mental health services and community education programs. The foundation would provide scholarships for veterans pursuing mental health careers, fund community dialogue programs, and support research into effective veteran reintegration strategies. After the ceremony, as Sarah mingled with family, friends, and community members, she was approached by a reporter from the regional newspaper who had covered her story extensively over the past 2 years. Sarah, looking back at everything that's happened since that morning at the coffee shop, did you ever imagine it would lead to all this? The reporter asked. Sarah smiled, looking around at the diverse group of people who had become her extended community family. Veterans were sharing stories with business owners who had learned to value their skills. Community leaders were making plans for new initiatives. Families were connecting across generational and cultural divides. I thought I was just defending my tattoo, she replied. I had no idea I was starting a conversation that would change not just how people saw me, but how they saw each other. The most powerful thing I've learned is that most people want to do the right thing. They just need information and perspective they didn't have before. Dr. Coleman joined the conversation, placing a proud hand on Sarah's shoulder. Sarah has demonstrated something that we talk about in theory, but rarely see in practice: the power of individual courage to create systemic change. She didn't set out to transform a community, but she was willing to be vulnerable, to share her story, and to engage with people who disagreed with her. What's next? The reporter asked. Sarah looked toward Colonel Mitchell, who was deep in conversation with city council members about expanding veteran services. She saw Mrs. Henderson talking with a group of young veterans about employment opportunities. She watched Frank Thompson showing his grandchildren how to properly display an American flag. We keep building, she said simply. We keep listening to each other, learning from each other, and creating communities where everyone's service and sacrifice is valued. We take what we've learned here and share with other communities facing similar challenges. As the evening wound down and people began to leave, Sarah found herself back at Miller's coffee shop, where it had all begun. The owner had invited the core group of people involved in the transformation to gather for a private celebration. The same booth where Mrs. Henderson and Mrs. Wilson had made their judgmental comments now hosted a planning session for the next phase of community veteran initiatives. You know, Mrs. Henderson said, looking around the cafe, I think about that morning all the time. I'm embarrassed by what I said, but I'm grateful for what it led to. Sometimes we need our assumptions challenged before we can grow. Colonel Mitchell raised his coffee cup in a toast to second chances, to change minds, and to communities that choose understanding over judgment. As they clinked cups together, Sarah felt the presence of Marcus and all the service members who had made the ultimate sacrifice. Their legacy lived on not just in the tattoos that honored them, but in the understanding and compassion that had grown from sharing their stories. Frank Thompson, now in his 70s, but more energetic than he'd felt in years, smiled broadly. You know, for 40 years I thought my service didn't matter to anyone but me. Now I realize that sharing our stories, showing our tattoos, being proud of our service, it makes a difference not just for us, but for everyone who comes after us. Outside the coffee shop windows, the small college town went about its evening routine. But beneath the surface, everything had changed. Veterans walked with their heads held higher. Employers looked deeper than appearance when evaluating candidates. Community members approached differences with curiosity rather than judgment. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message from a veteran in a neighboring county. Heard about what you folks accomplished there. Any chance you could help us start something similar here? She smiled and showed the message to the group. Looks like the ripples are still spreading. As they made plans to help other communities learn from their experience, Sarah realized that Marcus would be proud. The promise she'd made at his funeral to help veterans heal had grown into something far bigger than either of them could have imagined. It had become a movement of understanding that honored not just fallen service members, but all people whose stories deserve to be heard rather than judged. The tattoo on her arm, once a source of shame and something to hide, had become a symbol of courage, service, and the power of truth to transform communities. And in coffee shops, boardrooms, hospitals, police departments, and tattoo studios throughout the region, the legacy of that single moment of courage continued to grow, creating spaces where everyone's story could be honored and everyone's service could be valued. Years later, when other communities faced similar challenges with judgment and misunderstanding, they would hear about the small college town where everything changed when a young woman was brave enough to show her tattoo and share her brother's story. They would learn that transformation begins with individual courage, grows through community dialogue, and flourishes when people choose understanding over assumption. The memorial tattoo that had started it all remained as vibrant and meaningful as the day Sarah had gotten it. But now, instead of being something she hid, it had become a beacon of hope, proof that the stories we carry, the promises we make, and the courage we show could change not just our own lives, but entire communities one conversation at a time.